I'll hand over to our moderator. Alex Bolsh is a Professor of Politics at the University of Liverpool with research interests in policies on immigration and modern slavery. He currently leads the Anti-Slavery Knowledge Network, which seeks to apply innovative methods to tackle modern slavery across sub-Saharan Africa, funded by the UK government's Global Challenges Research Fund via the National Arts and Humanities Research Council. He's also Acting Director of Research at the Policy and Evidence Centre on Modern Slavery and Human Rights, which seeks to enhance understanding of modern slavery and transform the effectiveness of laws and policies designed to overcome it. With that, thank you, Alex.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Joseph. Welcome, everyone. First of all, thanks to the IOM for organising this event. It's very nice to be part of, and looking forward to each of the speakers who are going to give us, I think, a wonderful range of perspectives on the impact of COVID-19 on modern slavery. I'll just make some preliminary points, and I won't go until 1:15, so I'll try and finish and give the speakers a little bit more time, maybe even give us a bit more time for Q&A. But first of all, I'd just like to say that this is a very important time for all of us working on the topic of modern slavery to consider the impact of COVID-19 and to reflect on what we're doing and what we should be doing in response. On the one hand, the pandemic has created a sort of emergency type situation, immediate needs with a need to innovate and collaborate. I attended a Human Trafficking Foundation meeting towards the beginning of the pandemic, where there was a lot of exchanges around how to do client referrals and support people without the possibility of face-to-face contact. The challenges of using digital means with which to communicate, highlighting all the inequalities that we know about. But on the other hand, the pandemic also provides an opportunity, like every crisis, to rethink what we are doing and maybe do things better. I mean, the phrase "build back better" I think is now becoming perhaps a bit tired. Do things better, I think, might be a more appropriate catchphrase. But what does the data say? What are the sort of basics around what we know so far about the impacts? There's actually a wealth of information now emerging, and in some ways it's quite difficult to keep all of it in one place. And I think that's why this event is so useful, because there's all sorts of work going on, and I think it's important that we all hear about the work and the insights from experts and practitioners from different parts of the picture. But anecdotally, there are reports of increases in cases of exploitation and modern slavery, but the standard reporting systems in the UK are showing reductions. So we have the NRM data, which is released quarterly. With the last 2 quarters, we've seen drops in the figures, although Patrick, I think, is going to fill us in a bit more on the nuance and the underlying picture that perhaps we can glean from data on the national referral mechanism. And then the Modern Slavery Helpline, which has seen a fall in calls, and there's obvious explanations being put forward for this about the inability for first responders to come into contact with potential victims. But we've also had reports from, for example, I saw in a local paper yesterday from the Nottinghamshire Anti-Slavery Partnership, a 37% increase in referrals. So it's clearly not a simple picture. It's not it's not a straightforward issue to gather data about what's happening, and that's partly because the data sets that we have available are less than perfect, and of course that goes for all data, but in particular in this area, we are short of a complete picture of what's happening, and the COVID-19 pandemic has illustrated that in very stark terms. But we do have a growing number of techniques to look at prevalence, and I'll include in that the recent CSJ report, and perhaps Tatiana can tell us a bit about that when she speaks. But overall, I think the characteristics of the pandemic is to shed light on many issues which perhaps we already knew about, but which require more of a rethink than was expected. I'll just say, just before I hand over, one last thing. I'm involved in the Policy and Evidence Centre, and we've been running a consultation on how the research agenda should be moved forward. So a consultation on what priorities should be. And of course, COVID-19 is a really useful issue to think about what research should be doing in this area. And we held a roundtable at the end of last month. I just wanted to report a couple of points that were made in that roundtable, which was incredibly useful. And one point was that, can we learn lessons from the moment lockdown was announced? Because services were fairly unprepared. Charities in the charity sector became very vulnerable to a drop in funding. So there was a definite alarm there about the need to have more resilient systems and about identification and support without face-to-face interaction. And then the second point was, how actually can we conduct and continue doing research during a pandemic, because field work is no longer a straightforward thing. And there was a big emphasis on the need for us to collaborate and to use existing networks that we already have and work together so that we can take advantage of the fact that there are people on the ground who can give us a picture of what's happening. We might not be able to immediately call up, high quality quantitative data, but we can get anecdotal and qualitative results about what's happening. So the key issue is about trust within our networks to work together, to do research, to raise flags when needed, and to give policymakers the information they need to react. So I'll stop there, and because I'm really looking forward to what the others have got to tell us. So I'll just hand over to Patrick now and just give him a brief introduction. So Dr. Patrick Burland is a senior project officer at IOM UK. He has a PhD from the University of West of England, and his thesis was the response of trafficked adults in the UK. The responses to trafficked adults in the UK, rights, rhetoric, and reality. And in 2017, he won a Human Trafficking Foundation Anti-Slavery Day Media Award for the best written opinion piece dealing with modern slavery. And before joining IOM UK, he volunteered in support of domestic workers and immigration detainees. So I'll just hand over now to Patrick.
Thank you, Alex. So when the UK entered a national lockdown in response to COVID-19, many asked at that time what would happen to those already being exploited in parts of the economy like restaurants, nail bars and car washes, and how traffickers might seek to exploit people going forwards. One of the hypotheses at the time was that COVID could lead to an increase in the numbers of people being criminally exploited. Criminal exploitation was already a significant problem within the UK, so it was possible that traffickers could use COVID as an opportunity to expand their already existing operations. Traffickers could simply move those in a situation of labour exploitation into criminal exploitation. Now, in the time I have, I want to focus on the extent to which NRM referral data supports such a hypothesis. The total number of children referred as potential victims of criminal exploitation has increased in the last 6 months, but the number of adults has fallen. What the data does, however, show for the first 6 months of 2020 is a significant increase in the proportion of referrals to the NRM which are for criminal exploitation. Now, I know that focusing on NRM data can be a little bit dry, so I also want to use some evidence from newspaper reporting to highlight some specific examples of people who've been working in the UK prior to COVID, who ended up being recruited and transported to work in cannabis factories, sometimes hundreds of miles from where they've been living and working, to pay off the debts that they still owed. So on my first slide, I'm presenting only Q4 of 2019 and the first 2 quarters of 2020. This is because referrals for criminal exploitation were not published or recorded prior to Q4 of 2019, and seasonal comparisons are unfortunately therefore not possible. The first thing to say is that the number of referrals of potential victims of trafficking for criminal exploitation should be considered within the context of significant falls in the total number of referrals in the first 6 months of 2020. Now, despite a 23% reduction in referrals in April, May and June from the preceding 3 months, the number of people referred as trafficked solely for criminal exploitation actually rose by 14%. And while there were 34% fewer referrals in the 3 months of April, May and June 2020 compared to the record number in the 3 months at the end of 2019, there were almost exactly the same number of referrals of potential victims of trafficking for criminal exploitation in those periods. So during this period, the proportion of NRM referrals which were for criminal exploitation increased sharply, 38% of all referrals in the last 3 months of 2019 were reported as having experienced criminal exploitation. For the first 3 months of 2020, this was 42%. Now, these themselves are not insignificant numbers. However, for April to June this year, the total increased to more than half, with 57% of all referrals to the NRM being for criminal exploitation, either solely or in combination with another form of exploitation. Now, on my second slide, we can see that part of the reason why these cases make up such a large proportion of referrals is the increase in the numbers of children being referred as potential victims of criminal exploitation. The number of children referred for criminal exploitation exclusively rose 30% from Q1 to Q2 of this year. And 70% of children referred from April to June this year at the height of the lockdown were reported as having experienced criminal exploitation, either solely or in combination with another type of exploitation, such as labour exploitation and criminal exploitation. This was an increase from 60% of referrals from January to March. Now, at the same time, the number of children referred as potential victims of labour exploitation fell by almost half from Q1 to Q2. Now, a record 377 children were referred as potential county lines victims from April to June at the height of the lockdown. This is more than double the number from January to March. Now, this received a lot of attention in the media last month when the most recent NRM data was published. However, what the NRM data shows is that referrals of potential county lines victims constituted less than half of all referrals for criminal exploitation of children during that period. So there were 707 children who were referred as potential victims of trafficking solely for the purpose of criminal exploitation, and a total of 886 children who were reported as experienced criminal exploitation either in isolation or alongside another form of exploitation. Now, the statutory guidance for the UK Modern Slavery Act notes that child criminal exploitation includes a number of types of exploitation, including forced labour, forced theft, benefit fraud, drug cultivation and production, and county lines cases. Now, the introduction of data on county lines referrals is obviously highly welcome, but should there now also be specific reporting on the other forms of criminal exploitation recognised in the statutory guidance, and greater efforts to move beyond thinking just about county lines when considering and responding to the problems of the criminal exploitation of children. This could help us to better understand the nature of criminal exploitation that occurred during the height of the COVID lockdown, but also going forwards as we begin to face the longer term economic and social consequences of the pandemic and the responses to it. Given that almost 3/4 of children referred to the NRM in that 3-month period of height of lockdown were recorded as potential victims of criminal exploitation, better understanding this problem seems absolutely vital. So now in my final slide, the number of adults, we can see that the number of adults referred has fallen significantly, and the total number of adults referred as potential victims of criminal exploitation has also fallen. But what has occurred is a sharp increase in the proportion of referrals recorded as potential victims of criminal exploitation. 45% of all adults referred in the 3 months of April to June 2020 were reported as having experienced criminal exploitation, either exclusively or in combination with other forms of exploitation. In the last 3 months of 2019, this was only 25%. Between Q1 and Q2 of 2020, the number of adults referred as potential victims for just labour exploitation fell by 60%, while at the same time the proportion of adults referred as potential victims of a combination of labour and criminal exploitation increased to almost 1/5 of all adult referrals. Now, this might illustrate traffickers moving victims into criminal exploitation who had previously been in a business which was shut down due to COVID. Now, I think there are many examples from newspaper reporting over the last few months describing cases of those convicted for cannabis cultivation after being found inside a cannabis factory since the COVID lockdown, which illustrate to us what labour and criminal exploitation might look like at this moment. The fact that the cases I want to briefly mention don't appear to have been identified as potential victims of criminal exploitation or referred to the NRM, I think also reminds us that referrals for criminal exploitation within the NRM might be a particularly highly underrepresented category, as many of those victims will only be regarded as criminals. So one such case I want to discuss briefly is of a 23-year-old Albanian male given an 8-month prison sentence in July following a trial at Chelmsford Crown Court for his involvement in the cultivation of cannabis. Now, the court heard that he'd been in the UK for 10 months and owed £10,000 to those who brought him to the country. Prior to the lockdown, he'd been working in a car wash where he'd only received pocket money. When the car wash was shut down due to COVID, he was quickly transported to a cannabis factory. Now, the newspaper report mentions how within his time at the cannabis factory, he wasn't allowed to leave, that food was dropped off, and the only money that he'd actually earned was being used to pay off his debt. In another similar case at Durham Crown Court in July, an Albanian male was sentenced to 27 months in prison for cannabis cultivation after being found in a house containing almost 500 cannabis plants. The man had previously been working construction in London before the work was ended due to COVID. The person who'd arranged his entry into the UK and had found him the job in the first place, and who he still owed a debt to, had arranged for him to travel to Sunderland. The newspaper reported that he believed he was going to the North East to work as a decorator. Now, in both of these cases, the men pled guilty to the offence of cannabis cultivation, and obviously they were convicted. But I think these are useful examples to think about what a combination of labour exploitation, criminal exploitation could potentially look like at this moment in time. So to conclude then, obviously using NRM data is not without its limitations. And in particular, we should remember that referrals only represent potential victims of trafficking. There are a vast array of factors which might impact on numbers of referrals. And the number of referrals for criminal exploitation, particularly county lines exploitation, may have seen an increase because of greater visibility of children travelling in public spaces during a national lockdown, rather than necessarily being more children being exploited in this way. However, whether there's been an increase in criminal exploitation due to COVID, and regardless of whether or not the NRM data can show us this, I think the effort of looking more closely at NRM data regarding this problem highlights to us that 2/3 of children and almost half of adults referred to NRM were referred as potential victim of criminal exploitation. It's imperative that the systems, the NRM, and the support and assistance which is provided are able to respond appropriately to the experiences and needs of these very particular persons. And it highlights to us just how important it is that policy, practice, and legislation are ensuring the principle of non-punishment of victims of trafficking is upheld. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Brilliant, really useful information on the NRM data there, and great analysis. I think lots for us to think about in terms of the effects on of COVID-19. And I'll just quickly move on to our next speaker, which is Rebecca Helm. Rebecca is a team manager within Hestia's Modern Slavery Response Team, the largest subcontractor of the Salvation Army, responsible for the delivery of outreach support across all 32 London boroughs. Rebecca's worked in various frontline services providing support to survivors of modern slavery, previously within a female high needs safe accommodation in Sheffield for City Hearts, then later as a post-NRM programme coordinator in South Yorkshire and the North East. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Alex, and afternoon, everybody. So first of all, thank you so much for the invite to speak today and for IOM for arranging this event. I think this is a really important discussion. Hopefully, I aim to bring the perspective of a frontline service to this discussion and take away some learnings from the experiences that we've had as a service and the impact that it's had on our service users. So first of all, I'd just like to give a brief overview of Hestia and our service delivery, and secondly, how we've experienced challenges for our service users during COVID. I'd then like to talk about how we've actually changed and adapted our service to ensure that we are still delivering a robust and comprehensive service to our clients and meeting the needs of each of them. And I'd also like to pick up on some trends and learnings that we have had, and as a result, we understand how this will impact our future service. And also I want to pick up on sort of positive areas, so positive learnings that we have, things that we think we have worked well. And finally, kind of what Hestia would like to commit to do in the future and what we anticipate future challenges to be. So in terms of Hestia, so just very briefly, we are currently the largest subcontractor of the Salvation Army, providing support to survivors of modern slavery. So we deliver both accommodation-based services and outreach services across London. So yeah, all 32 boroughs in London. We are a huge service. So in June 2020, we had 1,589 service users, and this is actually edging towards the 1,700 mark currently. So huge. And we have a team of 150 staff delivering frontline services to those clients. We also do have a post-NRM service called the Venus Project, and they provide support to survivors with a positive CG decision. So moving on to the challenges faced by our service users during COVID-19. So first off, as we all know, being forced to stay pretty much indoors at home at all times has really been a struggle for us. But for survivors of modern slavery, this experience has simply been a reminder of past trauma. So facing the notion that their freedom to move has been halted and once again, limited, caused emotional turmoil for our clients. So this has exhibited itself over time in a deterioration of mental health and a heightened risk of suicide and self-harm attempts. So aside from life kind of grounding to a halt, they all of a sudden had very, very little to do. So I guess the lack of structure in their day, the lack of attendance to appointments such as GP, solicitors, and college attendance, this really I guess caused a lack of a sense of hope and purpose. A lot of us do find comfort in our close-knit community, our friends and family. You know, we've all been entertained by TV that we have at home and been able to access the internet, but our service users just simply do not have that luxury. Especially our clients who reside in NAS accommodation or temporary accommodation where it's very unlikely that they have access to Wi-Fi. You know, simply being able to keep up to date with the latest updates from the government on COVID guidance was very challenging. The impact from lack of Wi-Fi and tech was really also felt on lack of contact to friends and family abroad, access to counselling sessions, you know, college, ESOL lessons, parenting classes, and of course, you know, lack of face-to-face contact with their support worker. We also notice a lot of services being closed, so the lack of ability to be able to drop into their solicitor's office or maybe engage with mum and baby groups felt really like a lack of control for our service users and yet again a decline in their freedom. So the big conversation we as a service and our advocates have been having is ensuring that we're offering a lot of reassurance and a lot of motivational discussions to distract from, I guess, the lack of progression that we have seen in their cases. So this has come about, I guess, in a delay to NRM decisions, asylum decisions, not being able to attend home office appointments. A lot of our clients stuck in an emergency accommodation scenario such as Section 98 with NAS and not being able to progress in more permanent stable accommodation. This has really often led them to feel powerless to the situation. So again, a big job of our frontline staff was to ensure that we are creatively adapting our conversations and key working sessions to reflect really on the progress that our survivors have made to this point, and just providing joy in the day-to-day, providing a positive experience in those interactions with support workers. Essentially, we wanted to provide a more engaging conversation overall and ensure that they knew that we were still there advocating on their behalf and pushing towards recovery. Unfortunately, we have noticed a sharp increase of suicidal ideation, problems with anxiety, depression, and also substance misuse. So those service users that had substance misuse issues have on occasion relapsed, and so all the work and support in place that we had from their advocates prior to lockdown had kind of been flipped on its head, and they had to sort of start from scratch from a lot of the substance misuse recovery. So moving on to how we have responded as a service during lockdown. So of course we were forced to move the majority of our face-to-face support to telephone support in line with government guidance. We do respond and have responded to emergency situations where necessary, both in our accommodation and outreach services. We ensured that the frequency of contact was increased. So for our slightly higher needs clients, this contact meant that it was daily and reviewed on a regular basis to ensure that service users were comfortable and their wishes were being honoured in terms of the level of contact they wanted from their advocate. We were able to and still are able to attend our safe accommodation, but with very, very clear restrictions and often room-to-room isolation. In terms of specifically our outreach service, we did a lot of windowsill, as we call it, kind of interactions with our clients, so drop-offs of subsistence, donations, and food parcels on occasion. So we're quite reliant and are still very much linking up with local authority services, emergency appeal in local authorities and befriending organisations to help deliver food and other necessary items to some of our shielding clients. We provided PPE to our staff, and we had to amend the methods of travel. So we often would have used, tube travel in London, and this was not really appropriate for the extended periods of time it would take for us to get to some of our clients. So fortunately, we had heavily discounted taxi rides at the start of our lockdown, which proved really crucial in the hand delivery of subsistence and prepayment cards. One of the great things that we had access to was some food vouchers from Sainsbury's, so up to a value of £60 per client, and we were able to hand out, I think the amount overall was £12,500 worth of food vouchers, which was excellent. I guess moving on again to more of the positive outcomes, or more of the positive changes that we have made to our service. A big main highlight for myself and positive outcome was the result of an emergency appeal for funding for tech for our service users. So this was really successful. Each of our service user requests for tech was honoured, and we were able to source 114 brand new tablets to ensure that clients could continue engaging with studies and video meetings with counsellors, etc. Also, we received 250 smartphones, and 140 of those came with free minutes, free texts, and a data allowance, which again was crucial in terms of accessing services. Another positive was that we were able to carry out our annual project called Art is Freedom. So this usually involves a face-to-face training session with a photographer to ensure our service users could have the skills with photography. And during this time, we were able to do that remotely. So all the sessions were done via Zoom, and our service users had access to a smartphone to take the pictures that for them were meaningful and reflections of their experiences of modern slavery or how they felt about their recovery. And we were able to display these pictures across our social media in celebration of Anti-Slavery Day. A final sort of positive that I am really passionate about is the adaptations that we've made to ensure staff wellbeing. So all of the frontline staff and I guess workforce across the UK have really suffered during this time. And as frontline staff working with survivors of modern slavery, what they've had to do is provide constant emotional support, and also their jobs have fundamentally changed during the coronavirus lockdown. So where previously they were, seeing their clients face to face, most of the support had to change to remote support, and this led to a feeling of lack of fulfillment on occasion, and also that they weren't doing enough to help their clients. So what we have done is we've been able to move our clinical supervision groups to remote clinical supervisions via Teams. We run peer mentoring groups, which has been set up by our mental health first aiders. And we also made sure we really championed our COVID heroes, so those frontline staff that have really gone above and beyond during this time, so they deserve the recognition for that. So looking forward at future challenges, as already mentioned, we do anticipate different ways of exploitation and receiving referrals from different creative ways of trafficking. So whilst there is a decrease in air travel, we anticipate that there'll likely be a focus on vulnerable communities in the UK. And similarly, the journeys that trafficking victims will undertake to the UK will likely be more perilous and life-threatening.
Sorry to interrupt, but are you okay to finish up as soon as you can?
Sure. So in terms of yeah, I'll finish up with the final couple of points. So we had previously seen a decrease in referrals, and we anticipate the referrals will increase when lockdown eases, just with, I guess, yeah, spotting the modern slavery indicators by the public and authorities, and of course the pressure that will then have on our service when we get a sharp increase in referrals. And finally, interrupted funding. So we do anticipate the access that we have currently to funding and various pieces of donations. We anticipate that might also come to an end. Apologies for running over.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks so much. Yes, sorry for interrupting. Apologies,
okay. But don't worry.
I'm just aware that we just literally a minute or two over, so we're fine. And so I'll move quickly on to our next speaker, which is Tatiana Grenjardan. And Tatiana is the head of the Modern Slavery Policy Unit at Justice and Care, jointly created with the Centre for Social Justice. She has extensive experience working in the field of tackling modern slavery and human trafficking for over 15 years. In her previous role as a Director of Strategy for the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, Tatiana had a responsibility for overseeing the development and implementation of the Commissioner's strategic priorities, working closely with policy leads. She joined the Commissioner's team as Victim Support and Partnership Advisor, which is her main area of expertise. Previously, Tatiana worked as a Director of the Human Trafficking Foundation and a variety of roles at the IOM mission to Moldova. Over to you, Tatiana.
Thank you, Alex, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be presenting today on the impact of COVID-19 and in the UK, but I'll start by introducing the policy unit that I now head. It is called Modern Slavery Policy Unit. It is new and many may not have heard about it. It was established a year ago by a charity called Justice and Care and a think tank, the Centre for Social Justice, with the sole mission to keep modern slavery at the top of the British political agenda, to ensure that we fight this crime appropriately. And we're doing this by first and foremost placing the victim and their recovery needs at its heart for the policy and legislation that we are advocating for. We also aim to bridge the gap between those working on the front line and the corridors of power in Westminster, but also in the government, to ensure that their voices are being heard. And we're doing this by the research that I will be presenting today. Is just one of the examples of what this work is going to look like in future. And also we're working on a cross-party basis with MPs, bringing them together to nourish a new, fresh political leadership that we need in order to keep the spotlight on modern slavery and make sure it receives the attention it rightly deserves. So I will introduce the context for the research, which is called It Still Happens Here. We can go to the next slide. So what is the context of the report? So we all know that the Modern Slavery Act was introduced 5 years ago, and this year is the 5th anniversary. It was a direct result of the CSJ's first report published in 2013 called It Happens Here, that put forward about 80 recommendations, and the key one was introducing legislation, which then turned to be the Modern Slavery Act. So we decided to take stock and look, what is the state of the nation 5 years on, as our first piece of research to almost shape what I call our manifesto going forward, things that we will be focusing on going forward. So thankfully, just before the lockdown in January and February, I visited 6 areas across England and Wales to take evidence from frontline professionals, police, charities, local authorities. We work closely with local MPs as well. So we visited Leeds, Birmingham, Swansea, Loughborough, Plymouth and Southend. See some areas you'll probably ask why, and I specifically wanted to go to a variety of places, smaller, bigger, where I knew things existed in terms of slavery response and where nothing existed as slavery response, to just get this taste of what the response looks on the ground 5 years on from the Modern Slavery Act. And the cherry on top of our cake was a survey of more than 2,000 people to get the public perception in terms of what modern slavery looks like today. So our findings are, and I have to say that obviously when I was writing the report, the pandemic happened, so I had to go back and collect further evidence to feed into our findings in terms of impact of COVID-19, which will be the primary focus of this presentation, but I'll just briefly talk about the key findings of the overall report. So we concluded that there are thousands of men, women and children still being trafficked in the UK, with British nationals being the highest nationality on the rise, or the top nationality on the rise. We were able to get access to unique data, police data, that enabled us to come up with the new prevalence number, saying that there could be at least 100,000 victims in the UK today, with a cost to the taxpayer of billions of pounds in benefit fraud and tax fraud. We saw some amazing work on the front line. Really, the people who we've taken evidence from are really the stars fighting on the front line. But unfortunately, it is not a consistent picture across the country. The response is still patchy. We know that modern slavery is not yet treated as business as usual, as we would like it to be. We've also seen that few traffickers are ever prosecuted. We've seen amazing uplift in policing activity. So numbers, we know that in November 2016, there were 166 operations running, and now we have about 2,000 live investigations on modern slavery. So we know that the number of modern slavery crimes recorded has increased, and now is about 7,000 crimes recorded last year, which is all great news and shows that the awareness has increased amongst police especially. Local authorities also increased their referrals by about 20% over these years. However, in terms of prosecutions, we have not seen a commensurate increase, and yet we even have to say that the numbers have gone down last year, and this needs to be tackled. The primary reason that we were given why this is happening, apart from modern slavery being very complex crime and needing a lot of resources, was lack of victim engagement with the prosecution. And we have put a few recommendations forward in terms of how to remedy that. Victim care is not up to standard. I probably can spend an hour talking about that, but we know there are barriers and gaps from the moment of rescue to enter the national referral mechanism, the delays in decision-making process, the cliff edge after the exiting the NRM. All of that is still happening despite the reforms that we've been engaged with in the last at least 7 years that I know. In terms of public, they can play a role. We've seen that 2/3 of the public are more aware now of slavery than they were 5 years ago. Yet only 30% said that they know how to spot the signs, and only 40% said that they would know where to report this crime. So I think there is a lot of work yet to be done on educating the public what to do with the information they've got. I'd like to quickly talk about 100,000 number, next slide, because I think a lot of people are asking, where has this come from? So we worked with West Midlands Police, who have developed a new tool, artificial intelligence, called National Data Analytics Solution, that literally trawls the system and identifies cases of slavery, even in those cases where it was not tagged as a modern slavery crime or incident report. And the system was able to identify within the 12 months of 2017 that there were potentially more than 4,000 victims in West Midlands alone. We then extrapolated this data and based on the population, considering that West Midlands is a good area to be representative across the country because they have lower crime rates, and also it represents rural and urban population. And then we came up with a number of 100,000 potential victims across the UK, and we've recommended that the government does more, that so other police forces are able to use this tool to establish the true prevalence and scale of the crime. I'm going to now talk, I'm aware of time, so I'm going to move into the impact of COVID-19 and the what we heard from the evidence that we've collated very much reflects what Patrick and Rebecca were talking before, so I'm not going to stop a lot on that. But first of all, already in May, we heard that there were fewer victims rescued and exploited, which then saw a reflection in the NRM numbers. But we have to accept the fact that modern slavery response was completely shattered. For the first 4 weeks, we heard police officers working on modern slavery were redeployed. Everything was shut. We were not, it is obviously an unprecedented situation where we're not ready, not just the charities, but police, local authorities and others. So the numbers have gone down. Rebecca spoke about how the services had to accommodate, and that's across the spectrum what we heard. Decline in mental health, criminals changing their tactics and becoming much more abusive. And again, Patrick spoke about the cases, and we also heard of cases when men were moved from being exploited in car washes into cannabis factories, and then the growth of this criminal exploitation. We've also heard that the newest scheme that the government has put forward, furlough scheme, was exploited by the criminals as well. They were forcing people to sign pay slips that they were working more hours and then receiving money and never giving the money to the victims. Obviously, we saw that partnership work was completely disrupted, training was put on hold. It's only when we all gradually got used to using technology and adapted our ways of working, things started to pick up slowly at about May time. And then criminal justice on pause. Pam will speak about it after me, but just to flag, more than 500,000 cases now backlog in our Crown and Magistrate courts tells you something in terms of criminal justice and what we're going to facing after this. The last but not the least, I think, let's go to the next. The longer term effects. For
Tatiana,
me,
sorry, could you?
It's the wrap up. I'm not. Okay. Yeah, I know, Alex. So the last thing is, I believe that COVID has created a breeding ground for slavery and trafficking. The main drivers of modern slavery will intensify, and we need to be prepared by the way we respond to this crime and learning the lessons of the first wave as well. We know that there are a lot of vulnerable people in the UK. It's not just globally, a lot of people on universal credit and vulnerable children. Just think, last week, Sunday Times reported that there are at least 120,000 teenagers still not in school. And they're all there, vulnerable to be targeted by criminals. It's just a warning in terms of what we might be facing going forward globally, but also nationally. I'll stop here. I'm not going to go into recommendations, but I think everyone who is interested in what we've recommended could either read the report or just email me directly in terms of what we want to see government's response. Thank you. And sorry for running over a little bit.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tatiana. Actually, you literally 1 minute over, so thanks very much. We've kept it pretty much to time. I'll quickly now introduce Pam, and I think she's going to pick up, I presume, on some of the things you've raised there about prosecutions, because Pam Bowen is a senior policy advisor at the Crown Prosecution Service. She's a CPS lead for human trafficking and organised immigration crime, and has worked in developing policy for prosecutors and across government on human trafficking, organised immigration crime and prostitution since 2006. She was responsible for developing the first policy on the non-prosecution of victims of trafficking who had committed criminal offences in 2007. And she's worked with international organisations, ministers and government authorities in source and transit countries in negotiating and developing improved and collaborative responses to human trafficking, including training, mutual legal assistance, capacity building and developing policy to improve application of legislation, as well as contributing to development of European and international policy and guidance since 2009. Over to you, Pam. Right, thank you. If I just get my... Right, I don't have any PowerPoint presentation because I often find that it runs away with me. Right, I'm the final speaker, and it's always difficult to do after so many great and interesting presentations. So my experience on the impact of COVID on the criminal justice system has resulted from having to respond sort of really quickly and fairly agile in adapting to the development of new guidelines during COVID in relation to not just modern slavery, but also exploitation of prostitution and organised immigration crime, all of which are intrinsically linked. So I wanted to share some of those experiences today. So you've already heard from some of the previous speakers on the impact of modern slavery crimes on victims during the early weeks and months of lockdown in March or April of this year, which seems so long ago now. Closing down of international borders initially led to a reduction in drug supply and therefore exploitation of children in county line offending, a decline of victims trafficked into the country as a result of the effect of reduction in budget airlines, trains, vehicle traffic across borders, a decline of personal sexual encounters for sexual exploitation in flats, hotels and brothels, an impact on the gig economy and loss of work for exploited migrants, all of which led to a complete displacement of victims. Also a significant move to digital devices to recruit and exploit victims, particularly on the dark web. Intelligence across the sector was relatively poor. For those subjected to labour exploitation, this may have been due to a fear of losing any means of earning a wage, however exploitative their job was, the alternative being nothing at all. Victims of labour exploitation who did retain their jobs were forced to accept even lower wages as competition for work increased as unemployment grew. And there are some anecdotal accounts that victims were moved between sectors as COVID restrictions came into force. For example, those working in restaurants and nail bars were moved into shellfish picking, often in dangerous conditions. And as Tatiana has alluded to, the introduction of the government's furlough scheme provided exploiters with additional opportunities to make money from victims and to effectively double their money, with those victims eligible to work in the UK. And claims were made in their names while they were forced to continue working. There was also anecdotally move to forced camsex in adult services websites as personal encounters became impossible. So all of that's had quite an impact on access to justice as well for victims of trafficking. It led to a reduction in identification and reporting by victims during lockdown, as victims were often unable to escape their situation, and investigating agencies were sometimes unable to physically disrupt. But while access to justice was still available, there were clearly difficulties in accessing legal advice and accessing counselling for victims, particularly face-to-face. There was also backlogs and delays, not just in criminal proceedings, but also civil, immigration and asylum and employment proceedings, all of which were impacted. So the impact on investigation and prosecution, including international investigations, led to a change to the Code for Crown Prosecutors, that is the decision to prosecute. And on the 1st of April of this year, the CPS and the National Police Chiefs Council published interim charging arrangements asking police to prioritise only those cases where charging decisions needed to be made to ensure the most dangerous offenders were dealt with quickly. Prosecutors were also asked to consider the impact of COVID-19 as part of their application of the code when considering whether to charge a case. But in cases where the offence was more serious and there was sufficient evidence to prosecute, the more likely it would be in the public interest. So modern slavery cases fell into that final category. There was an impact on those in custody, particularly children in police detention, with also ongoing cooperation with joint investigations and coordination meetings. So the UK at the time is participating in 18 live joint investigations with other countries into human trafficking,
5 other EU member states are involved. Now, these have all continued throughout the pandemic. These agreements were established pre-COVID, and as far as possible, investigation and evidence gathering has continued through the use of technology. Largely, investigations that have been referred to the CPS to prosecute have been proactive, using intelligence, digital downloads, financial investigation to evidence offences, which have increased significantly and continued through lockdown as they don't rely on victim testimony. These are the cases which have often resulted in defendant guilty pleas right throughout COVID. We've also moved to telephone and video statements and use of digital signatures in evidencing cases. So briefly, an impact on the criminal justice system has been for criminal justice sort of actors. COVID has been the catalyst for accelerating the development and use of technology, in particular the rollout of cloud video platforms for conducting remote hearings. And whilst courts have continued to operate through COVID, there has been a reduction of 60% in court hearings because of the falling court capacity. And as Tatiana has alluded to, a massive backlog of over 500,000 hearings. But having said that, there was already a massive backlog pre-COVID as a result of closing down courts, reduction in court staff, and a reduction in sort of advocates. So all of that has been further exacerbated because of COVID. So a significant delay to trials resulting from lockdown of courts, which clearly impacts on victim and witnesses' continued engagement with criminal proceedings. For all vulnerable victims, trying to recall their evidence many months later will obviously be far more challenging. Although victims can still provide their evidence in chief through pre-recorded video interview, and in limited circumstances, they can provide pre-recorded cross-examination, which means that they can still provide their testimony and move on with their lives, even if trials are delayed. The government has also extended, that's increased custody time limits for defendants awaiting trial in custody to ensure that those who remain at risk of flight or harm to others are not released. And as courts and jury trials have started increasing since May 2020, court listings then has required a robust judicial approach, triaging cases to assess priority. So considering defendants in custody, serious of the case, length of trials, and also the needs of victims. Many courts now have extended their court sittings from 9 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock at night to get through the backlog, but have also had to deal with an increase in caseload associated with COVID-related crime. So the current and future impact and the legacy of the total shutdown of courts has meant now that trials are now being listed at the end of 21-22. Some cases are being listed into 2023. Lengthy trials, which modern slavery cases often are, will clearly have to be factored into court availability. Courts opened in May 2020 under special arrangements to ensure safety and social distancing, but not all courts are assessed as being suitable to hold jury trials. So to enable appropriate social distancing, 2 courtrooms are used for 1 trial, linked by closed circuit TVs, with a further courtroom for jury deliberations. There's a use of plexiglass for jurors to keep them separated, and media and public will also have to be separated, as well as entrances and exits into courts. However, advice changes virtually every week to reflect changing government advice in different regions, as well as different jurisdictions, as COVID rates go up, meaning that witnesses and jurors cannot travel to courts. And although they're participating in legal proceedings, which counts as essential travel, if a witness or a defendant is in a high-risk area, that advice changes, and obviously sort of listing arrangements are further sort of exacerbated. There's an increased use of technology to ensure many hearings can continue remotely, but obviously that's more difficult where jury trials are involved. But I also keep in contact with my modern slavery prosecutors in Scotland and Northern Ireland. I know in Scotland they are using cinemas for juries, with proceedings being heard in high courts with only court staff involved, with defendants being beamed in through video link from custody, but with the trials actually streamed onto the big screen in allocated cinemas, and juries actually sitting in cinemas watching the big screen for court proceedings. There's also consideration here of Nightingale courts.
Wind up.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So anyway, that's it. That I've just about finished. A quick ramble through, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pam, and sorry to interrupt just at the end. I was just hoping we could have about 10-15 minutes for questions. I'm not sure if the chat is even available at the moment. I haven't seen any comments. I don't know if if we can open the chat up to allow people to put any questions to the panel. Apparently the chat is open, so please post your questions. We've got we do have at the end, I will hand back to Joseph, but I think we'll keep the maximum amount of time open for questions. And as I think was mentioned, if you don't get yours answered, we will try and make sure that that happens after the event. Someone asking for a recording. I think this has been recorded, so I assume it will be available for people to listen to afterwards. While we're waiting, I think maybe I could use my role as chair. Although, if actually, as I'm saying that, some people have already started putting questions. It's going to be a bit of a challenge to keep track. So the first question, as mentioned by Rebecca, being locked in due to COVID-19 might trigger traumatic memories. Do you think you will be able to gather sufficient funds to provide psychological help to the victims? And I'm going to gather a few things and maybe go back to everyone. Second question, no one has yet commented about the impact of Brexit. Consider the Dubs Amendment on unaccompanied migrants and uncertainty over the EU settled status. Perhaps those are enough. So are the funds to provide psychological help to the victim? Perhaps that goes back to Rebecca. And then maybe the question about Brexit, I think maybe all of you could respond to. But yeah, first of all, Rebecca, and then the rest.
Yeah, so in response to the psychological support, so currently our survivors do access a range of psychological support, so whether that's through the NHS or whether that's privately. We haven't met kind of a barrier in terms of accessing funds for private psychological support currently, but as you can imagine, this has increased significantly, and it's things such as the NHS will offer a certain set of sessions at a time, so maybe that's 8 sessions, and what we're noticing is when that does come to an end, trying to advocate for that to continue. So I guess it's really a point about the NHS being able to provide a continuation of really important psychological support because COVID is continuing, and yeah, we're not really seeing an end in sight. So I guess that's really the issue that we are facing with psychological support currently.
Apologies, Patrick. Alex, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to hand back to either Pam or Tatiana or Patrick about Brexit and the potential issues around settled status.
Right. I might be able to cover some of that. Obviously, we don't know yet what the agreement is going to be, but as far as sort of criminal justice investigating and prosecuting cases are concerned, we are sort of still working for, at the very worst, a no deal exit. But we have already, for example, in joint investigations, coordination meetings, transfer of evidence, and everything that we do with Europol and Eurojust, we have already renegotiated all of those. And so all of the JITs that we have at the moment will continue. The Dubs Amendment on unaccompanied migrants, which was sort of excellent intervention by Alf Dubs, but that has obviously been agreed in the Lords, but has had to sort of ping pong back to the Commons. So it depends on sort of what the Commons, the House of Commons then sort of debate and decide on that. So presumably it'll just ping pong between the two houses until a decision is or agreement is reached.
Thanks, Pam. I don't know if Tatiana, you want to add to that, and then afterwards maybe Patrick can come in on the question in the chat on the NRM. Yeah, go ahead, Tatiana.
No, just briefly, I think, Tom, thanks for your question. I think the reason we haven't really touched upon this is because we were asked to focus on the impact of COVID. So perhaps a suggestion for IOM is to host another event where we can start talking about Brexit, which combined with COVID, I think, like we were all worried about impact of Brexit pre-COVID. Now with all the COVID implications on top, I think it is a big issue and question we should be considering, and all of the things being exacerbated. So as Pam said, there is a lot of uncertainty. We're yet to see what it's going to mean for victims in terms of support. We know EU directive is not going to be automatically transposed into the national legislation, but we still have the Council of Europe Convention to count upon for in terms of providing victim support. Pam's mentioned in terms of criminal justice system. Settled status, there is a lot of uncertainty there, but I think that's another thing maybe we need more research on. So Alex, make sure that your colleagues in the MSPAC are focusing on this.
Yeah, good suggestion. Yeah, I think we should. I don't know, Patrick, if you can see the question here about the NRM referral stats and whether
I can see that question. Yeah, I can try and respond to that as best I can. Obviously, yes, it is. It's very possible that the number of cases is significantly higher than those referred into NRM, but on the basis that people are being arrested and prosecuted rather than being referred into NRM, or that people in situations like cannabis cultivation hidden away in households or factories or wherever they might be, are just never found. I mean, that applies to all of the kind of referral exploitation types within the NRM, but the NRM only really gives us a very small number in regards to those who've actually ever been identified and referred. In regards to the question about whether or not we could look at statistics on the positive kind of decisions by exploitation type, that isn't something I think at the moment which is available. Unfortunately, although the data that's being published now on NRM decisions there is an increasing amount of information and transparency on this. So we can now see decision data by age group and also by nationality on the basis of whether UK or EU or non-EU. I think providing decision data for different groups of different types of exploitation would be really useful, would be really important to see what are the outcomes for potential victims of criminal exploitation in their decisions compared to, say, maybe potential victims of domestic servitude or labour exploitation, and how that might be different for children who've been referred as potential victims of criminal exploitation compared to, say, adults who've been referred as potential victims of criminal exploitation. I think often there seems to be a slightly different kind of standard in regards to decision making. It might seem, sometimes you see these cases where it seems like a person shows a lot of indicators of exploitation, but it's not being treated as such. And you can be a potential victim. You can be recognised as a victim of trafficking and still be found not to, have a defence under Section 45. And I think sometimes people are being given negative decisions as victims of trafficking just as more of a factor about whether or not it was reasonable for them to have committed the criminal offence. In regards to the other point, about the sort of scale and nature, from around the country, there's been increasing reports about the sort of volume of cannabis cultivation specifically going on around the country since lockdown. Bedfordshire police have identified more than 100 cannabis factories since lockdown, and there's been reporting about across the country in local newspapers about a massive increase in the numbers of people being found in cannabis factories. So local papers in Bolton, in Teesside are kind of highlighting cases where they're saying an increased number of potential victims, or people they even describe as victims of trafficking in these newspaper articles who've been found inside cannabis factories. But the Q3 NRM data isn't coming out until I think November, and I guess at that point we will have a better sense of what the NRM referrals show as we've kind of emerged from lockdown and we look at the months of July, August and September, and we might have a slightly different picture and we can see what's happening then.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I mean, we assumed, I think, at the beginning of the year that we would see, a before and an after, and there'll be a sort of a back to normal phase. But obviously, that's not been how it's gone, and we're looking at a much longer time period of effects and the going in and out of different forms of lockdown geographically as well. I mean, that'd be interesting to see how that is reflected in the data. Just another question, I think, before I hand over to Joseph. The question about the routes now being used into the UK, current trends and source and transit countries. That might be rather a large question to answer in a very, very short, compressed time. I don't know if anyone's got any last comments about trends and about patterns that they've been noticing. Pam, you're shaking your head. I think maybe thinking it's quite a lot to answer in a couple of minutes.
Yes, as I say, we saw a shutdown sort of during the first couple of months, but it depends on the route by which victims are being brought into the country. So by and large, it will depend on international borders, sort of their closures, what flight routes have opened up. Again, we know that quite often budget airlines are used for trafficking victims in, but it's sort of most things that we're seeing at the moment tend to be migrants coming in, obviously through use of small boats and freight, and obviously many of those are destined for sort of exploitation as well. So there are a lot of Iranians, Syria coming in through the across the channel on small boats. And I guess as and when a lot of budget airlines start opening up again, we'll see sort of more from those countries that have traditionally, sort of been our main source countries. But still don't have enough information on that to make a comparison with pre-COVID.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much. And I'll just repeat the thanks. And we've only got 2 minutes, so I wanted to just quickly hand over to Joseph again to say the goodbyes and thank everyone for coming.
Yes, thank you, Alex, and thank you everybody for joining today. Just picking up on a couple of the comments there on questions and answers, we'll try our best to provide answers to some of the questions that haven't been covered. We'll also circulate the video to this via email, probably through a video link. So just to cover that question, I think all that remains to be said is to thank all of the panelists today, Pam Bowen, Patrick Erland, Rebecca Helm, Tatiana Granjardin, and to thank Alex in particular for his moderation of today's session. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.